Just in the last 500 years, we've seen the rise and fall of the British Empire. We've seen the rise and fall of the Dutch Empire, and looking further back, we've seen the Roman Empire going from the biggest, strongest, most dominant force on the planet, and today, it doesn't even exist. Now, Ray Dalio, one of the world's greatest investors, has studied the past 500 years and he found history to repeat itself over and over. And so he found a cycle. And we are now at the stage of that cycle where we are seeing a new world order. The last time this happened was in 1945, where we began a new world order after the war, where it was decided how the world would be divided and the Bretton Woods monetary system came in and the US dollar took over from the British pound as the world reserve currency. Fast forward to today, and we are now seeing three forces that did not exist before in our lifetimes, but they existed in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and in the lead up to the New World Order of 1945. So are we headed for an era similar to the Great Depression? Well, in this video, we'll be looking at exactly what these three forces are, so stick around till the end of this video so you can position yourself in the best possible way for what's about to come. Hey, what's up people? Welcome back to our channel Ralph Finance UK. Now, Ray Dalio, one of the world's greatest investors, has studied history and he found three forces that are present today that were also present in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Firstly, the central banks and the government are being pushed to use all three monetary policies. I mean, number one, interest rates have already been lowered to near enough 0%. Number two, the central banks are now forced to print trillions and trillions of dollars and buy financial assets, and so we have the production of a lot of debt. And number three, we're seeing furlough schemes, bounce back loans, and mortgage repayment support programs, all designed to help the individual person. If we step back, we can view the bigger picture, and Dalio calls it a debt cycle. And if you understand this, trust me, you really start to understand how this whole economic machine really works. So we start with establishing a dominant power, just like the US became a dominant power just after World War II. After this, you have a period of peace and prosperity because there's a dominant power that no one wants to fight, as fears of bad times diminish, just like the 1950s. We then see the development of a lot of credit as people grow and expand, and we see the invention and development of a lot of new technologies, and productivity increases. Then we start to see the wealth gap develop, as the rich benefit from the prosperous period the most, and we also start to see values gaps and political gaps develop. As the opportunities to borrow and get into debt keep growing, the country gets deeper and deeper into debt. This was ultimately what pushed President Nixon to announce that the US dollar will no longer be backed by gold, as they just couldn't sustain the current system.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
The US needed more money than they had in gold, and so their only option was to turn the US dollar into a fiat currency. And because the US dollar was and still is the world reserve currency, when the US dollar lost that tie to gold, it meant the same for every other currency in the world, including our Great British Pound. And so it's always important to consider what's going on with the US dollar, because chances are it will affect our British Pound. So we then start to see limitations. People and businesses get into more debt. People are now over leveraged and can't pay back debt. Productivity reduces as spending is cut. Some people lose their jobs, and this causes the economic growth to level off, as the central bank can't easily produce money and credit anymore. So at this point, the central banks lower the interest rates in a bid to get people to spend and stimulate the economy. Now, there is a chance this will work and it will be enough to get people to spend. And this is what we saw in 2008. These are called recessions or mini corrections, and they happen every 8 to 10 years. And Dalio calls this the short-term debt cycle. Interest rates are lowered, people spend again, and then productivity is back up and we continue to thrive. Now, there is a problem when the central banks lower the interest rates to pretty much 0% and the economy still isn't stimulated, and they can't lower the interest rates anymore. This signals the long-term debt cycle, and this is what we are currently seeing. Many central banks around the world have implemented a negative rates policy, and when lowering interest rates doesn't work anymore, central banks are then forced to resort to their next tool, quantitative easing, and this is the printing of money and buying financial assets. But these purchases of financial assets make those investments go up in price, just like we've seen the stock market boom over in the US and in the UK to a lesser extent. Now, this is great for the people who have the investments, but not so great for the people who don't have the investments, and all this does is widen the wealth gap. Dalio remarks that the stock market is rallying, yet the queues for the food banks over in the US are just getting longer and longer. And now with this pandemic, this has accelerated the gap. The poor keep getting poorer. People can't keep up with their mortgage payments. Many people have already lost their jobs. They can't pay their bills. And so now the government has to step in to implement the third monetary policy, which is a fiscal policy. And for us in the UK, this means bounce back loans, furlough schemes, mortgage repayment programs, and so on. And this is exactly what we're seeing happen today. All of this, the central banks implementing all three monetary policies, this is signalling that we are at the same stage of the debt cycle that we were back in the 1930s and 40s. Usually at this point, we are due for a new type of money and a new type of credit, and this happens every 50 to 75 years, and we call this the long-term debt cycle. This is what we saw happen as soon as World War II ended in 1945. We saw a new world order, and we saw a new monetary system come into place, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the US dollar took over as the world reserve currency, and the signs are telling us we are at the same stage of the debt cycle today. So this is the first force we are seeing in society, all three monetary policies being used. Now before we go on to the second force, if you are finding value out of this video, which I really do hope you are, then I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that thumbs up button, as it gets our content in front of more people just like yourself. Now the second force we are seeing today that was present in the 1930s is a polarization in society. A lot of people are divided now. It's not as prosperous and peaceful as it used to be. We can see this in the very, very large wealth gap we have today, and it's actually the largest wealth gap we've seen since the 1930s. And Dalio found when we see these huge wealth divides, usually this is accompanied by huge political divides and huge values divides as well. I mean, there was a lot of tension leading up to our election between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and the same sort of thing in the US between Biden and Trump. And now we are seeing a lot of tension between people who support the vaccine and the people who are against it. As I said before, this colossal printing of money and pumping it into the stock market has helped the rich so much, and it's hardly helped the poor. If we look at the top 640 billionaires in the US, then we see their wealth grew by $845 billion during this pandemic, while on the other hand, we are seeing 42% of people falling behind during this pandemic. And in the UK, the top 10% of households own around 45% of the total wealth, and that was in 2018. I can only imagine how this is now. And so this conflict, this polarization, this wealth divide, it's the second force we are seeing in society today. And we saw this in the 1930s. Now, before we go on to the third force, if you're finding value out of this video, which again, I do hope you are, then I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that thumbs up button, as it really helps get our content in front of more people just like yourself. And it also means more of our videos are recommended to you. Now, the third force we are seeing is the rise of a new empire which challenges an existing world power, and that is China. China is an extremely fast-growing country, and if we look through history, whenever there's an existing world power and there's a rise of a new challenging power, we see conflict, and this leads to wars and eventually a new world order. This is essentially what happened in World War II. And it's not just the typical fighting wars. Nowadays we have trade wars, technology wars, and geopolitical wars. For example, over in the US in the 1930s, they saw the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised import duties, and the point of this was to protect American businesses. And more recently, we've seen former President Trump attempt to ban Huawei, the Chinese multinational tech company. Ray Dalio describes that the main difference between the US and China is that the US works on individualism, the unit is the individual, whereas in China, the unit is the family. Dalio describes it as a bottom-up approach. You have individual entrepreneurs who want to make money, and so companies are put together by these people. And this is the same sort of way it works in the UK. But in China, it is a top-down approach. Dalio describes the Chinese government as similar to running a big company. Now, I'm not saying which is better, but what I will say is that this family approach has worked well for China. Since 1990, they've managed to increase their disposable incomes by nearly 28 times. Since 1994, their GDP has been increasing every year by around 6.7%. And if we look over the course of 2006 to 2018, then we see that the US GDP increased by around 50% over this time frame, whereas China's GDP has increased by nearly 5 times. China's poverty rate has gone from 50% in 2000 to now less than 1%, and they've lengthened their life expectancy by nearly 6 years just in the last 20 years. So these are the three forces that did not exist before in our lifetimes, but they existed in the 1930s during the Great Depression and in the lead up to the New World Order of 1945. Monetary policies coming into play at an extreme level, the extreme wealth and political divide, and the rise of a new world power. And so it could be possible that we will see a new world order at some point in the near future. We have to remember things happen in cycles. At one point in 1913, the British Empire held sway over 412 million people, 23% of the world's population at the time, and by 1920, it controlled 24% of Earth's total land area. At the peak of its power, the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was often used to describe the British Empire, as the sun was always shining on at least one of its territories. And now, there is no real British Empire left anymore. One empire comes, another challenges it. It is all a cycle. Before World War II, it was actually the British pound that was the world reserve currency, but the war ended the old cycle and began the new one that we're in today, the Bretton Woods Agreement. So does Ray Dalio think we are headed into a depression era? Well, Dalio views the current times as the defining moment where we are due for a new world order. Dalio says we've seen that happen repeatedly in history. These things happen pretty quickly, they may last a couple or 3 years, then you have a rebuilding and they're dealt with creativity. And he mentions the greatest force is the force of adaptation and inventiveness. And what's interesting is that he views this restructuring as a stress test. Dalio says it could be said that it is really healthy in many ways because it is a stress test. Because if you look at history, people get weaker or they're not prepared in many ways. Weaker in terms of maybe they don't build enough savings or maybe they emphasize luxuries over necessities. And so he views this restructuring as a way for us to keep progressing as a collective human race. Now please understand, I am not trying to justify any actions of any empires in the past, but if we just for a second focus on the positives, then we see that when the Roman Empire came into force, we saw the invention of the first welfare program. They created postal services, sewer services, newspapers, books, roads, highways, and the calendar we know and use today is actually very closely related to the Roman calendar. The ancient Egyptians created toothpaste, wigs, door locks, and they're the ones who created taxation. The Chinese Empire invented the compass, paper, and gunpowder. The British Empire invented the steam engine, the world's first railway, the light bulb, the electric motor, and the chocolate bar. And the US, after the World War, they invented the lunar module, the personal computer, the mobile phone, the digital camera, and the internet. So when great empires exist, we see creativity and inventiveness and huge advancements in the human race. Now what Dalio is concerned about is one side trying to beat the other side and doing damage. Because history has shown us when we have these three forces that I talked about, we see demonstrations, protests, riots, and violence. He says, when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. So it will be really interesting to see how this whole thing plays out in the next few years. These are critical times for all of us, and although history does repeat itself, there is always that chance we see something completely new happen that none of us had predicted. Will the stock market continue to boom while the economy is still barely recovering? Will the US dollar keep losing value? Will Bitcoin take over, or will the Federal Reserve implement their Fed coin, or will we see a completely new monetary system? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found value out of this video, then please do give us a thumbs up, and why not subscribe so you don't miss our next financial education video. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.